I've spent 3 decades studying the patterns of collapse, not as theory, but as recurring historical fact. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that what most Americans believe about survival is fundamentally wrong. The billion-dollar prepper industry sells gear, weapons, and freeze-dried meals while ignoring the documented psychological and social realities that actually determine who survives systemic breakdown and who doesn't. During the Great Depression of the 1930s, families with basements full of canned goods still lost everything because they didn't understand the unspoken rules that govern survival in collapsing systems. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, people with emergency supplies died while others with nothing but clear thinking lived. And the difference came down to principles nobody teaches openly. The 2008 financial crisis revealed that communities with strong social networks and mutual aid systems weathered the storm, while isolated individuals with substantial savings still lost homes, marriages, and futures. What I'm about to share with you are 12 unwritten rules drawn from historical collapse patterns, military survival psychology, emergency management research, and my own 5 decades of studying how societies fragment and how individuals endure when institutions fail. These aren't hypothetical scenarios or doomsday fantasies, but documented principles observed across the Great Depression, multiple hurricane disasters, economic collapses, supply chain breakdowns, and every major American crisis of the past century. Before we continue, I need you to watch this entire presentation because understanding these rules in isolation won't save you. Only grasping how they interconnect will prepare you for what's coming. So stay with me until the end and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, your city and country, because these patterns are accelerating globally. The first rule is the one that catches everyone off guard because we've been conditioned to focus on physical preparedness while ignoring psychological reality. And here it is. Your mind breaks before your body does. During the World Trade Center attacks, researchers documented that individuals who survived often weren't the strongest or best equipped, but those who could perceive reality accurately without succumbing to denial, while simultaneously refusing to surrender to hopelessness. The conservation of resources theory, developed through decades of disaster research, demonstrates that psychological distress emerges not from the disaster itself, but from the threatened or actual loss of mental, social, and economic resources. In Hurricane Katrina's aftermath, survivors exhibited probable PTSD rates approaching 50%, and the prevalence of serious mental illness doubled. But those who maintained what researchers call resilient functioning shared specific psychological characteristics, including self-enhancement tendencies and positive emotional regulation, even amid catastrophic loss. The practical application here isn't abstract. Military survival psychology teaches that mental conditioning must occur before crisis, because once collapse begins, your brain will default to ingrained patterns. Depression-era oral histories reveal that families who mentally prepared for prolonged hardship by updating survival strategies their mothers and grandmothers used in previous hard times adapted faster than those encountering scarcity for the first time. Your mind is your primary weapon, and if you haven't trained it to accept harsh realities while maintaining operational capacity, no amount of stored food will matter because panic, denial, and hopelessness kill faster than hunger. The second rule addresses timing, and it's brutally simple. The 72-hour window after collapse determines everything that follows. Hurricane Katrina provided stark documentation of this principle. Individuals who evacuated within the first 72 hours faced exponentially fewer obstacles than those who waited just days longer. Research on disaster response reveals that survivors who take decisive action during what emergency management specialists call the critical decision window establish advantages in positioning, resource access, and alliance formation that become nearly impossible to replicate once chaos solidifies. During the 2008 financial crisis, families who immediately restructured debt, liquidated vulnerable assets, and formed mutual support networks within days of recognizing systemic instability weathered the prolonged downturn better than those with more resources who delayed action. This isn't about reacting to every potential threat with panic, but about understanding that once genuine collapse indicators appear, bank runs, supply chain failures, institutional breakdowns, widespread civil unrest, The difficulty curve of forming alliances, securing resources, and establishing defensible positions increases exponentially with each passing hour. Economic principle applies here, just as in markets. First mover advantage in crisis scenarios is real and documented. The families who left the Dust Bowl early found work and housing in California. Those who waited face camps, starvation, and a decade of suffering. You must develop the capacity to recognize genuine collapse signals distinct from temporary disruptions and act within that 72-hour window, because delay costs everything. The third rule contradicts every instinct that modern consumer culture has trained into Americans, and it's this: invisibility is your best gear. During the Great Depression, families who publicly displayed preparedness or remaining wealth became targets for desperate neighbors, roving groups, and even local authorities looking to redistribute resources. The principle extends beyond simple operational security. It encompasses auditory discipline, light management, and what military tacticians call signature reduction across all domains. If you've spent years building food storage, acquiring tools, and developing self-sufficiency, the last thing you want when systems collapse is for that knowledge to be public. Depression-era survivors consistently report in oral histories that families who kept resources hidden, maintained appearances of struggling alongside neighbors, and never advertised capability survived intact, while those who flaunted security were systematically targeted. This applies to modern contexts. Social media posts about preparedness, visible security systems, and conversations about your supplies all create intelligence that will be remembered and exploited when scarcity triggers desperation. Light discipline matters because a house with electricity or generator power during grid failure becomes a beacon attracting both desperate refugees and predatory opportunists. Noise control matters because sound travels farther in collapsed environments where normal ambient noise disappears. Smoke from cooking fires can be detected miles away and advertises both resources and position. The strategic principle is borrowed from natural selection. The organisms that survive aren't the strongest, but those best adapted to remain undetected by predators. Your visibility makes you vulnerable, and in collapse conditions, everyone becomes a potential threat regardless of their pre-collapse character. The fourth rule is so fundamental that missing it proves fatal, yet it's consistently underestimated. Water is currency, and everything else is negotiable. Human biology doesn't negotiate. 3 days without water and you're dead, which makes water the ultimate non-negotiable resource. During every documented collapse, from the Dust Bowl to Hurricane Katrina to modern supply chain disruptions, water access immediately becomes the primary determinant of survival. But here's what most preparedness advice misses: storing water is only the beginning. You need renewable sources, multiple purification methods, and the knowledge to implement both when infrastructure fails. Historical water scarcity crises show that mortality rates spiked not from initial shortage, but from disease caused by consuming contaminated water out of desperation. Traditional knowledge that sustained humans for millennia includes water purification techniques, using sand filtration, solar disinfection, plant-based treatments, and mineral-based clarification that work without electricity or modern chemistry. Depression-era Americans who understood these traditional methods survived, while those dependent on municipal systems suffered when those systems failed. The strategic principle here is that water isn't just for drinking. It's required for sanitation, food preparation, hygiene, and medicine, meaning your calculations must account for far more than survival minimums. A family of 4 needs approximately 1 gallon per person per day just for drinking. But realistic planning requires 3 to 5 gallons per person daily when accounting for all uses. That's why renewable sources, wells, springs, streams, rainwater collection systems become essential, because no amount of stored water lasts forever. Learn to purify water using multiple methods now, because that knowledge becomes literal currency when collapse makes clean water scarce. The fifth rule connects directly to the fourth and addresses the economic reality that most people never calculate. Calories are actual currency, and every action costs irreplaceable energy. During the Great Depression, families learned brutal lessons about energy economics. Every choice to expend physical effort had to be weighed against caloric cost, because food scarcity meant you were spending principle rather than living on interest. The human body requires approximately 2,000 calories daily just for basic metabolic function, and physical labor, stress response, and temperature regulation in harsh conditions can double or triple that requirement. Depression-era survival strategies documented by historians show that families calculated every activity's energy cost against its return. Walking 5 miles to trade goods might cost 400 calories, but yield food worth 2,000. That's a good trade. Chopping firewood for 8 hours might burn 3,000 calories, but provide only minimal heating advantage. That's a losing proposition unless temperature threatens survival. Modern Americans have lost this calculation entirely because food abundance makes energy expenditure irrelevant. But in collapse conditions, this mathematics determines who lives and who starves despite having supplies. The strategic application is that you must become efficient in all operations, eliminating wasted movement, unnecessary labor, and energy-intensive activities that don't provide proportional returns. This is why fitness matters more than people realize. A body that operates efficiently requires fewer calories for the same work, and maintains strength on reduced rations has a massive survival advantage. Depression survivors stayed alive by making their bodies do more with less, patching and repairing instead of replacing, and ruthlessly eliminating any activity that cost more energy than it returned. You need to start practicing this economic thinking now, tracking your actual caloric expenditure and return on daily activities. Because when collapse comes, this calculation becomes life or death. The sixth rule presents a paradox that catches most people completely unprepared. Fire is simultaneously essential and potentially fatal because your survival asset can become your greatest liability, depending on context. Fire provides heat, enables cooking, purifies water, and offers psychological comfort. But it also generates light visible for miles, smoke that advertises position, and heat signatures detectable by anyone with basic thermal observation capability. During periods of social breakdown, historical records show that homesteads displaying fire became targets because fire signals resources, fuel, food to cook, people with enough security to risk visibility. The tactical problem is that humans need fire for survival, especially in cold climates. But using fire carelessly broadcasts your location to everyone within visual or olfactory range. Military survival doctrine addresses this through what's called tactical fire management. Using minimal fuel, creating fires only when necessary, employing smoke discipline, and understanding when fire's value outweighs its risk. Depression-era families who survived in rural areas learned to use small, hot fires that produced minimal smoke, to cook only during times when smoke would be less visible, and to develop alternative methods for warmth and food preparation that didn't require open flame. Traditional knowledge includes haybox cooking, where food is brought to boil then insulated to finish cooking without fuel, solar cooking using reflective surfaces, and cold weather survival techniques that minimize fire dependence. The strategic principle is understanding context. Early in collapse, when security is uncertain, fire discipline is essential. Later, when positions are established and communities formed, fire becomes more acceptable. But most Americans have no concept of this because we've lived our entire lives with unlimited artificial heat and light. So we never develop the capacity to manage fire as both tool and threat. You need to practice now. Learn to build fires that produce minimal smoke, understand fuel efficiency, and develop cooking methods that don't require sustained open flame, because the day may come when lighting a fire could cost you everything. These 6 rules form the foundation: psychological resilience, temporal awareness, tactical invisibility, water primacy, energy economics, and fire discipline. But they represent only half the picture, because survival isn't just about individual capability, but about understanding the human dimension that emerges when systems fail. What history teaches us, what every collapse pattern confirms, is that the rules governing interpersonal dynamics, social structures, alliance formation, and moral frameworks become more important than physical preparedness once the initial crisis stabilizes into prolonged breakdown. The Great Depression lasted over a decade, and those who survived didn't just have supplies, They had community networks, mutual aid systems, and the moral discipline to maintain human bonds when scarcity triggered our worst tribal instincts. Hurricane Katrina revealed, within days, how quickly social order fragments, and how community resilience determines outcomes more than individual preparedness. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated that economic collapse doesn't just destroy wealth, it severs relationships, dissolves trust, and forces impossible choices between self-preservation and collective survival. The next 6 rules address these human variables, the strategic thinking required to navigate collapse's social maze, and the uncomfortable truth about what really determines long-term survival when everything we take for granted disappears. These aren't comfortable topics, and they'll challenge assumptions you've held your entire life. But understanding them is the difference between communities that rebuild and those that consume themselves in predatory chaos. The 7th rule strips away the comfortable mythology that survival planning focuses on and confronts the variable that actually determines outcomes in every collapse scenario. People are the variable, not the disaster itself. Natural disasters follow predictable patterns. Hurricanes track meteorological models. Earthquakes release along fault lines. Economic collapses follow documented cycles. But human behavior under extreme stress remains fundamentally unpredictable and far more dangerous than the initial crisis event. Hurricane Katrina research documented that the hurricane itself killed relatively few people compared to the chaos that followed, where social breakdown, institutional failure, and human predation created conditions more lethal than the storm. The conservation of resources theory applied to disaster psychology reveals that survivors face greater threats from resource competition with other humans than from environmental hazards once the initial event passes. During the 2008 financial crisis, the economic mechanisms of collapse were straightforward and followed historical patterns, but the human responses, panic selling, trust collapse, social fragmentation, amplified and prolonged the damage beyond what pure economics would predict. Depression-era oral histories consistently emphasize that the greatest threats came not from hunger or weather, but from desperate neighbors, roving groups of unemployed men, and the breakdown of social contracts that normally govern human interaction. The strategic implication is that you cannot plan for human variables the way you plan for resource needs, because desperation transforms character in unpredictable ways. People you trust completely today may become threats tomorrow when their children are starving. Communities that seem stable can fragment into tribal factions within days when scarcity triggers our evolutionary survival instincts. The only defense is developing what military and intelligence professionals call threat assessment capability. The ability to read behavioral cues, recognize deception, identify predatory intent, and make rapid trust decisions based on observable actions rather than historical relationships. This isn't cynicism, but realism grounded in documented collapse patterns across cultures and centuries. You must accept that the disaster is the easy part and that navigating human behavior afterward requires completely different skills than stockpiling supplies. The 8th rule addresses the timing problem embedded in the 7th and states it plainly. Pre-collapse alliances are non-negotiable because forming trust networks after systems fail becomes exponentially more difficult and dangerous. Community resilience research demonstrates that the single strongest predictor of disaster survival isn't individual preparedness, but pre-existing social capital and mutual aid networks. During Hurricane Katrina, neighborhoods with strong community bonds evacuated together, shared resources, and protected vulnerable members, while areas lacking social cohesion descended into chaos despite similar resource levels. The 2008 financial crisis revealed that communities with established mutual support systems, faith congregations, veterans organizations, ethnic solidarity networks, rural cooperatives, weathered prolonged economic stress far better than affluent but atomized suburban populations. Depression-era survival depended almost entirely on community networks because individual families simply couldn't produce, preserve, and protect everything needed for long-term survival. Historical mutual aid societies, barn-raising traditions, and harvest cooperatives weren't quaint customs, but survival mechanisms that distributed risk and pooled capabilities across extended networks. The strategic principle is that you must build these alliances now, while institutions still function and trust can be verified over time. Because attempting to form alliances after collapse creates impossible verification problems. How do you trust strangers when communication networks fail? Background checks are impossible, and desperation incentivizes deception. You can't, which means post-collapse alliance formation carries massive risk of infiltration by predatory opportunists. The people you'll survive with are the people you're building relationships with today, family obviously, but extended to like-minded neighbors, community members who share your values, people you've observed under stress and found reliable. Faith communities represent particularly valuable networks because shared moral frameworks and regular pre-collapse interaction build the trust foundation that becomes essential when everything else collapses. Veterans networks offer similar advantages because military experience creates shared understanding of discipline, hierarchy, and operational thinking. Rural communities maintain advantages over urban environments, specifically because interdependency hasn't been destroyed by anonymity and transience. You need to be cultivating these relationships now, contributing to your community, demonstrating reliability, and identifying who shares not just your preparedness mindset, but your fundamental values about human dignity, mutual aid, and long-term thinking. The ninth rule introduces tactical thinking that runs counter to human comfort-seeking, but emerges repeatedly in military survival doctrine and historical collapse patterns. Routine is a death sentence because predictability creates vulnerability. Human beings are creatures of habit who find psychological comfort in routine. But that very predictability becomes exploitable by anyone observing your patterns. During periods of social breakdown, when predatory behavior increases, historical records show that targeted raids focused on predictable behaviors. Families who fetched water at the same time daily, farmers who followed consistent planting schedules, homesteads where lights appeared on regular patterns. Military survival training emphasizes pattern disruption as fundamental security protocol, because adversaries observing your movements can predict future behavior and plan attacks for maximum advantage. The principle applies across all domains. If you travel the same route daily, someone can position an ambush. If you perform tasks on a fixed schedule, someone can time an assault when you're maximally distracted. If your defensive posture follows predictable cycles, someone can identify vulnerability windows. Depression-era families who varied their routines, randomized their activities, and maintained operational unpredictability survived while those following rigid patterns became targets. The tactical application isn't about paranoia, but about incorporating variation into daily operations. Change routes regularly. Randomize timing of necessary activities. Avoid fixed schedules that can be observed and exploited, and never establish patterns that telegraph your capabilities or resources. This extends to communication. If you're signaling allies, vary methods and timing. If you're maintaining watch rotations, randomize rather than following predictable shifts. If you're moving resources, never use the same path twice. The psychological challenge is that humans resist this because unpredictability creates cognitive load and anxiety, but that discomfort is the price of security. You need to start practicing operational variation now so it becomes habitual rather than additional stress during crisis. Because predictability in collapse conditions is invitation for disaster. The 10th rule is so fundamental to survival thinking that military strategists consider it baseline operational planning, yet civilians consistently ignore it. Always have 2 exits, minimum, from any position or situation. During Hurricane Katrina, people trapped in buildings with single exit points died, while those with multiple escape routes survived even when primary exits failed. The principle extends beyond physical architecture to strategic positioning across all domains. You need exit strategies from your location, from your community, from any alliance or situation you enter. Historical collapse patterns show that entrapment creates the highest mortality rates because once you're cornered with no alternatives, you become completely vulnerable to changing conditions, whether environmental or human-caused. Military survival doctrine requires establishing rally points, caching supplies along multiple escape routes, timing how long each route takes under various conditions, and identifying what obstacles might close specific exits. Depression-era migrants who survived the Dust Bowl were those who recognized environmental collapse early, maintained mobility, and had destinations with family or community connections rather than fleeing randomly into uncertainty. The 2008 financial crisis demonstrated the same principle economically. Families with diversified income sources, multiple skill sets, and financial flexibility survived, while those trapped in single income streams or illiquid assets faced catastrophic losses. The strategic application requires thinking through every scenario and asking what happens if your primary plan fails. If you're sheltering in place, what's your evacuation route if that position becomes untenable? If you're evacuating, where's your fallback location if primary destination is compromised? If you're depending on a community alliance, what's your contingency if that alliance fractures? American frontier wisdom emphasized never camping without clear escape routes, never entering confined spaces without knowing how to exit, and always maintaining the capacity to move, because the settlers who survived were those who could adapt when conditions changed. You need to physically walk your escape routes now, cache supplies at intervals, establish rally points with family members, and practice timing under various conditions, because when crisis hits, you won't have time to plan. You'll only have time to execute. Before we continue with the final 2 rules that address the long-term psychological and moral dimensions of survival, I need to ask you to support this channel, because creating deeply researched content that challenges conventional thinking requires significant time and resources. Please hit the like button if you're finding value in this information, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future content, and activate the notification bell, because these topics often face algorithmic suppression. Most importantly, comment below and let me know where you're watching from, your city and country, because understanding how these principles apply across different geographic and cultural contexts helps build a global network of informed, prepared individuals who refuse to be victims of collapse. The 11th rule addresses something that modern consumer culture has systematically destroyed in Americans. Patience is your ultimate weapon, and the survival value of strategic waiting exceeds almost any other capability. We live in a culture of instant gratification where delay feels like failure. But historical collapse patterns consistently demonstrate that survivors aren't those who act fastest, but those who time their actions correctly. During the Great Depression, families who panicked and sold farms or businesses for immediate cash lost generational wealth, while those who endured through the worst years and waited for recovery maintained assets that eventually restored prosperity. Hurricane Katrina showed that initial evacuation created massive advantages. But once that window closed, those who patiently waited for conditions to stabilize before moving often fared better than those who panicked and fled into equally dangerous situations. The 2008 financial crisis rewarded patience dramatically. Investors who panic-sold at market bottoms lost everything, while those who maintained discipline and waited through the downturn recovered and often prospered. Military survival psychology teaches that most dangerous situations resolve themselves if you can simply endure without taking precipitous action that exposes you to greater risk. The strategic principle is knowing when to move versus when to shelter, when to engage versus when to wait, when to spend resources versus when to conserve. This requires developing what traditional wisdom calls discernment, the ability to read situations accurately and time actions for maximum effect with minimum risk. Depression-era survivors consistently emphasize that patience in the face of immediate hardship prevented desperate decisions that would have created worse long-term outcomes. Faith traditions across cultures teach patience under trial not as passive acceptance, but as strategic positioning that preserves capability until conditions favor action. You must cultivate this capacity now, because modern life trains the opposite: immediate response, constant activity, decisive action even when patience would serve better. Practice delayed gratification, develop comfort with uncertainty, and learn to distinguish between situations requiring immediate action versus those where patience improves outcomes. Resource conservation through delayed action extends survival timelines, and knowing when to move versus when to hold position often determines whether you survive at all. The 12th and final rule addresses what no one teaches because it contradicts our basis survival instincts. Yet it emerges repeatedly as the determining factor in long-term survival across every historical collapse. Moral discipline determines outcomes more than physical preparedness because ethics don't disappear in crisis. They intensify. Community resilience research demonstrates that neighborhoods and groups maintaining strong moral frameworks and mutual accountability during disasters recovered faster and suffered fewer long-term psychological consequences than those where social order collapsed into predatory opportunism. Faith-based communities like the Amish, Mennonites, and certain evangelical networks consistently show superior disaster recovery because shared values create trust, cooperation, and mutual aid that multiply individual capabilities. Depression-era oral histories reveal that communities maintaining moral standards, protecting vulnerable members, sharing resources, enforcing accountability, emerged from the crisis intact, while those descending into theft, exploitation, and violence fragmented permanently. The uncomfortable truth is that predatory behavior shortens survival timelines rather than extending them because exploitation triggers retaliation, isolation from mutual aid networks, and psychological damage that degrades decision-making capacity. Historical collapse patterns show that individuals and groups who maintained ethical standards rooted in human dignity, personal responsibility, and community obligation survived longer and rebuilt faster than those who adopted survival of the fittest mentalities. This isn't naive idealism, but documented pattern recognition. The traditional cures for social breakdown are accountability systems, honor codes, and justice frameworks that maintain human bonds even under extreme stress. American values of self-reliance paired with responsibility for community welfare create the optimal survival framework because pure individualism leads to isolation and death, while pure collectivism destroys initiative and creates dependency. The balance is self-sufficient individuals who voluntarily cooperate through shared moral frameworks rather than coercion. Faith serves as psychological anchor in uncertainty because it provides meaning beyond immediate survival, maintains hope during prolonged hardship, and creates moral guidelines that prevent the descent into behaviors that ultimately prove self-destructive. You need to examine your own moral framework now and ask whether your values will hold under extreme stress or whether scarcity will trigger compromises that destroy your humanity and your long-term survival prospects. Now we arrive at the twist that reframes everything I presented, and it's this uncomfortable truth. You're preparing for the wrong collapse because most people envision sudden catastrophic scenarios when historical reality demonstrates that collapses are slow, grinding, economic and social erosions punctuated by crisis accelerations. We imagine Mad Mac's instantaneous breakdown when actual collapse patterns look like the decade-long depression, the multi-year Dust Bowl migration, the prolonged aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, or the ongoing effects of 2008 that never fully recovered for millions of Americans. The 12 rules I've outlined apply to gradual collapse more than sudden catastrophe because survival in extended breakdown requires sustainable systems, community networks, moral frameworks, and psychological endurance rather than short-term crisis response. More critically, these rules apply now because we're already experiencing incremental collapse indicators that anyone studying historical patterns recognizes immediately. Supply chain fragility demonstrated by pandemic disruptions, institutional distrust approaching historical highs, economic volatility masked by artificial monetary intervention, political polarization exceeding levels seen since the Civil War era, resource depletion accelerating across water, topsoil, and energy systems, and social atomization destroying the community bonds that historically enabled survival. Every generation of Americans has faced its collapse moment. The Civil War destroyed the antebellum economic and social order. The Depression shattered assumptions about perpetual prosperity. World wars demanded total mobilization that restructured society. The Cold War created existential nuclear threat. And ours is unfolding now through compounding crises that won't resolve into either apocalypse or normalcy, but will grind forward as deteriorating conditions punctuated by acute emergencies. The current vulnerabilities are documented and undeniable. American household debt exceeds $23 trillion, creating systemic fragility. Topsoil erosion threatens food production within decades. Water scarcity already affects Western states and will intensify. Political dysfunction prevents addressing any systemic problem. And social trust has collapsed to levels historically associated with pre-revolutionary conditions. These aren't predictions, but observable present conditions, which means the 12 rules aren't for someday, but for right now. Living these rules today means understanding they're not emergency protocols, but lifestyle principles for navigating prolonged uncertainty and periodic acute crisis. Mental resilience developed through daily practice rather than waiting for disaster. Water knowledge and renewable sources established before municipal systems fail. Caloric efficiency and physical fitness maintained as ongoing discipline. Fire management and tactical thinking incorporated into normal operations. Community alliances built through years of demonstrated reliability. Moral frameworks reinforced through daily choices that prepare you to maintain humanity under stress. The historical optimism embedded in these rules is that Americans have survived every previous collapse through exactly these principles: psychological toughness, practical skills, community cooperation, strategic adaptation, and moral grounding in values that transcend immediate survival. The synthesis of self-reliance with community responsibility, individual capability with mutual aid, practical preparedness with spiritual resilience creates the optimal framework because it honors both personal freedom and collective welfare. Faith, family, freedom, and pragmatism represent cultural survival advantages when combined rather than isolated. After spending 50 years studying how societies collapse and how individuals endure, I've learned that survival isn't about fearing the future, but about respecting historical patterns and living with intentionality today. The 12 rules reveal that preparation is less about accumulating supplies than developing capabilities, less about isolation than building community, less about physical stockpiles than psychological resilience and moral discipline. Assess which rules you're weakest in and start there. If your mind lacks resilience training, begin mental conditioning now. If you lack community, start building those networks today. If your skills depend on infrastructure, learn traditional methods that function when systems fail. If your moral framework remains unexamined, engage the difficult work of establishing values that will hold under stress. The time for preparation isn't after collapse becomes obvious to everyone, but now, while you still have options, while communities can still be built, while knowledge can be gained without desperate urgency. These rules offer you dignity and agency in uncertain times, transforming you from potential victim to capable survivor, from isolated individual to community asset, from reactive fear to intentional preparedness rooted in historical wisdom and proven principles.